he was so young, and he was actually very healthy. He was, oddly enough, a big supporter of competitive paintball. He was, in good shape, in good health, everything. It was just like a very strange incident that killed him.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Today we're going to talk about a celebrity, of course, as we always do. A celebrity that all of you will know and was part of a group of three. No, not Three Dog Night. Maybe that era. And not just that era, more recent for those of you. I don't want to lose any of you. But this celebrity is somebody that I think that you'll find his life very interesting and his untimely death, sadly. So, Marley, introduce us to the subject this week.
Yeah, today we're talking about Maurice Gibb, who is 1/3 of the Bee Gees. If you don't know his name, you'll probably definitely know the Bee Gees. Very successful, musician, songwriter. They all achieved world fame. They are very well known, wrote a lot of songs that are still well known to this day, including our favorite CPR song, Stayin' Alive, and won many, many awards, and was just a really well-known guy, very good at his craft, and he was amazing.
Stayin' Alive. Justin, why don't we have this? What would it cost us to have this as the theme song?
More than you want to pay.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, that kind of ties in with something we'll talk about here in a little bit, and that's royalties. You still ought to investigate that. Do you have any idea, though? Have we checked on similar things in the past?
Yes, but the problem was that each individual song has to be authorized with the artist and the publisher, songwriter. So,
or whoever owns, I guess, the recording itself.
You could have, maybe the publisher says yes, but the songwriter says no. And you're kind of stuck at that point. Even if you want to hand them a mountain of cash, maybe they don't want to authorize it for that purpose. So, but each and every instance is its own bit of research every time.
And that does make sense. The reason it makes sense is that you really want to control your brand and your image. And when it's music that is not simply played on the radio, for example, which would be standardized if it's playing somewhere that is part of a large quantity of music. Whereas when it's associated with a particular business or promoting in effect a particular product or service, then yeah, it does make sense. It's very discretionary, and everybody signs on because they're all really owners. Because the royalties that are generated are shared. I mean, so part of it is coming from who owns the recording itself, like a studio typically, who owns the rights having written the music, which is the copyright.
There's a show I'm watching right now on Netflix called Loudermilk, and it's about this guy who's running like an AA meeting. One of the guys in the group was in a band in the 80s. And
why would we not be surprised to hear he's in an AA group? Go ahead.
So all the rest of the guys are going to get a big payday, like $100,000 each, for putting their song in an alcohol beverage commercial. And the guy that's in the AA group, he's like, I can't do this. And all the rest of the guys in the band are like trying to convince him to put the song in because they want the money. But he's like, I can't stand for that anymore.
And they need his permission.
Correct. Yeah, because he's the fourth songwriter.
Very interesting. Marley, did we take you off your course? Sorry about that.
No, you're good. You're good. I like all the banter. I like hearing all the things Justin's been watching.
Well, Justin watches stuff I've never heard of, but go ahead.
Me either. So, but yeah, Maurice, he was a great guy, obviously, but very well known. Singer-songwriter, all of the things. He was born in December of 1949 in Douglas, Isle of Man, and he was actually the fraternal twin to his brother Robin Gibb, and he was younger by Robin by 35 minutes. So I'm sure that was a theme for them growing up of who's the oldest. But as we'll see, he's very close to his brothers. He did have an older brother named Barry and an older sister named Leslie. And then they also did have a younger brother brother named Andy. Andy was not in the Bee Gees, but he did go on to be a singer-songwriter as well. And he also died in, I believe, 1988. So he passed around the age of 30, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah.
Talented
And
guy, too.
oh, very talented. Yes. And so was their sister Leslie. They all were very, very talented, and they all went on to have great careers in music.
Weren't their parents musicians?
His dad was a drummer, and I believe
That's
his
right.
mom was a vocalist.
Yeah. Yeah. So they definitely had that gene, whatever it was. And it's a great experience growing up. But go ahead.
Yeah. So in January 1955, Morris would have been about 5 years old. The Gibb family moved from Manchester, England, and they moved to, I believe, Australia. And it was kind of around that time, which you think 5 years old, wow, that's young. But it was kind of around that same time that him and his brothers began like harmonizing and singing together, and they were really noticed by the parents. And then in that same year, they actually all started their music career. So two 5-year-olds, and I believe Barry was only like a couple years older than them, around like 8, I want to say. And they made a group. It was a skiffle, which I learned a new term today because I was like, what is skiffle? But it was a skiffle rock and roll group called the Rattlesnakes. And it was his brother and then two neighborhood friends, Paul Frost and Kenny Horrocks, who were in it.
And they stayed together quite a while. I mean, you think of a band like that with kids 8 and 5 and 6 years old, you think, well, it's going to last a couple months. But this lasted for a number of years.
Yeah, it definitely did. And the Bee Gees were formed directly out of that whenever the two neighborhood friends just left. But I mean, they weren't like, famous by any means, but they stayed together. They were pretty well known around where they were. And
they got gigs, didn't they?
Yeah, they definitely got gigs. So like their first major appearance was in 1957. A local cinema was like playing films and they invited children to sing in between the films. And on the way there, they were planning, I believe, to sing off of like a record or something, just like along with it. But Barry actually dropped it and broke it. And so when they got there, they had to sing live. I mean, they were going to be singing live anyway, but without like a backup track or anything like that. And everybody loved it. They were just like super impressed by these kids. And they thought like, wow, something's really going to come out of them.
Well, and it did.
It definitely did. Yeah. And then in around, I believe, 1958, when Morris was 9 years old, they immigrated to Australia. And then it was in Australia that the Rattlesnakes evolved to the Bee Gees. And that was around 1958 as well. I believe that was towards the end of 1958. But Morris's musical influences and his brothers also were, obviously the Beatles, Everly Brothers, Cliff Richard, Paul Anka, and they just really loved these guys. They took a lot of what they, know from them, and they kind of sounded a little bit similar in some of their things to them, but I definitely think that they eventually made their own way and made their own sound.
So how soon did they end up with a record contract, and when was their first hit?
So it looks like their first single was released in 1963, but it didn't chart. But then they went on to release, I believe it was New York Mining Disaster 1941, and that was released in 1967, so not to be confused with the title. And then they released a couple of hits after that in like the 60s and 70s. That was to Love Somebody, Massachusetts, and I've Got to Get a Message to You. And those were their bigger hits that got them really up and going and kind of brought them to fame.
And Morris was co-writing at the time most of their songs. I think he and Barry had their names on more songs than any other combination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they definitely did. But Morris didn't sing a lot, though. He was more instrumental, and I think he kind of found a love in like playing that role because he was definitely like their guitarist, their bassist, their keyboardist, and he contributed to like the backup harmonies, but there's only a few songs that he's the main vocals on. But I think he was just like a wonderful like instrumental genius, and that's why they kind of kept him back there doing that.
Yeah, and he wrote well as a co-writer. He didn't write a lot of music independently, but he was great as a co-writer. And I've often wondered, and I couldn't find this, whether he's primarily a lyricist or the tune side of the music. But in any case, to compete against Robin and Barry, I mean, Barry we associate with that high falsetto voice of the disco era, which he did so magnificently. And then Robin had this feminine, high voice that if you listen to Massachusetts, it's really amazing, that voice in Massachusetts. It is so high. And yet, you can tell it's a guy, but it's a very high voice. It's almost like that song from Take It to the Limit of the Eagles. Who was the guy that had that incredible voice with the Eagles? He left, and he left fairly early in the Eagles, probably in the early 2000s. But
Randy
Meisner. Randy Meisner. Yeah, he had this incredibly high voice. And so Robin did too. And then you had, of course, the falsetto of Barry. So I think that everyone played a particular important role in this division of labor that was the Bee Gees. So you needed somebody for all those roles.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And then kind of from there, we hit the disco era, which if you know the Bee Gees, you know them probably well for their disco era. And that's where they hit a lot of their peak success as well. They produced the soundtrack for the film Saturday Night Fever, and that included the tracks Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, How Deep Is Your Love, all of the ones that are still well known today. Not saying there are other ones aren't, but whenever anybody, hears anything about Stayin' Alive, that automatically just comes to mind.
Yeah.
I think Bee Gees are also one of those few groups where you don't think of just their music, but their style, their clothing style.
Yeah.
It's like instantly puts that in your head.
It's a package with them. Yeah,
Yes,
the visuals, because they were in an era that was so associated with television and movies.
Same with Elvis or ABBA.
Yeah. They definitely had an image. So let's talk a little bit about Maurice's personal or family life. He married, right?
Yeah. So he married his first wife, Lulu Kennedy, Cairns, I believe, in 1969, and they were married from 1969 to 1973. They had no children, and she did divorce him due to his struggles with alcoholism, which we'll talk about as well. That becomes a big, part in his life. And then they get divorced, and then he meets Yvonne Spenceley, and they get married in 1975, and they're married all the way from 1975 up until his death in 2003. And she's the mother of both of his children, Adam and Samantha. And she also helped Gibb throughout his rehabilitation process, which you'll kind of be like shocked that she does, especially after you hear the story of what happened between him and his family during his alcoholism years. But she was strong. She stayed right by his side, and they got him through it. And I mean, he was all the better for it.
So, we'll talk then about those years.
Yeah. So, he started drinking, I don't want to say he started drinking. He took his first drink at the age of 17, which Europe 18 is normally the legal age anyway. But it was because John Lennon actually bought him his first Scotch and Coke. And Maurice, I recall listening in an interview, and he was like, John Lennon was the coolest guy. He bought me this drink I had never drank before, but I drank it and I just choked it down, because Scotch and Coke is probably a very strong drink to have for your first one. And he was like, I just wanted to be exactly like him. I wanted to hang out with my friends and be really cool and drink and so on and so forth. So he kind of partied a little bit, but he didn't really cross into the alcoholism until he was around 25. And obviously it very, very much severely affected his relationships with both of his wives and his children too. And his son Adam said, that daddy lied to us all the time, and that like Maurice would become very like verbally violent towards his family. And so growing up, I don't think he had the best relationships with his kids, especially when they were younger. You have to remember he was kind of at the like top of his fame, and just had a lot going on, but that's not really an excuse too. But then leading up to the big like awakening, in October 1991, Maurice pointed a loaded gun at his wife and his children, and he was intoxicated during this time. And the incident was like a really big wake-up call. After it, Yvonne moved out for a couple of days, and she kind of isolated him from the kids. And then his brothers both gave him like really tough love tactics, because their brother, Andy, had just died like a couple years earlier too. And
which was
they
drug
were like,
related.
yes. And they were like, we don't want to lose you the same way that Andy went or anything like that. And Morris had kind of been in and out of rehab every so often, and he attempted to get sober a couple of times, and then he experienced a relapse right after Andy died in 1988. And Morris really blamed himself for not getting to his brother in time, and he blamed himself for his brother's death as well, which is why he fell back into that alcoholism. But after the gun incident, he really recommitted himself to sobriety, and he attended regular AA meetings, and he actually remained sober for the rest of his life, which is, that's actually absolutely amazing, especially for singer-songwriters, as we know on this show that all the stars really go through a lot, and some of them die from it. And it's really sad to see, but he wanted to make sure that he didn't go out the same way as his brother, and that he was there for his family, and he was active, and he could be, who he really wanted to be.
Okay, so let's kind of fast forward a little bit and get to what we regard as kind of the meat of our program, and that's to get to the time toward the end of his life. We know he's had a successful career. He's had only one divorce, which puts him in an elite group among celebrities. So that's a good thing, as we've talked before, for a lot of reasons. And he's had a long marriage to Yvonne, during which he's attacked this alcohol, primarily alcohol. I'm sure there were drugs involved, but primarily alcohol. And he attacks it and ultimately overcomes it. The Bee Gees managed to stay together, though there were some rough spots between the Bee Gees. We shouldn't imagine that there was perfect harmony, no pun intended, between these three members. And that by that I mean that there were times that they did, I'll use the word separate. There were times when they pulled away from each other. One was in the late 60s. And actually, Maurice is credited with being the person who really was the force that encouraged the others to come back together. So there was always this temptation lurking in the background for each of the what were four Bee Gees, musically speaking, that there was always this temptation to go off on your own and build a career, and they all thought they could do that. I think Maurice was the one who was most grounded, and he recognizes that the three together would be far better and far more successful and leave a legacy in a way that three of them individually, even added up, would not be able to do. So he recognized that. Andy, they even tried to bring in Andy Gibb. They made all efforts to salvage him later in his life, and you would think that would have been a real graphic warning to Maurice, and I'm sure it was to some extent to all of them, and eventually Maurice got it. But Andy's self-destruction was something that all of them watched powerlessly despite efforts, and they even wanted him to come with the group. But again, he had this independent artist, this solo syndrome. And solo syndrome happens a lot when you have successful groups, in that there's this sense each of them may have, but usually there's just a couple of them, perhaps, that are thinking, sometimes just one of them, that, I can do better than this on my own. I don't need these guys. I don't have to put up with this stuff. And the stuff being all the things you put up with to participate in any sort of group activity. Anytime you do something as a team, you surrender some of your autonomy. And why would anybody surrender their autonomy to a team unless they felt that there was a net benefit? They felt that in exchange for these concessions, these compromises, that they're going to be more and better than they ever could be on their own. And the moment you get somebody in a group that's thinking that's not true, then the group is doomed. And with the Bee Gees, there was that sense that didn't it didn't, I think, dominate the group except for a few times during their career. In the late 60s, it did. There was a time in the early 90s when definitely it did. Of course, the group wasn't as successful as it had been. And so there were periods, but because they were brothers, I think that provided a sort of glue that groups like the Beatles don't have going for them. So I think that this cohesive relationship going back so far probably kept them together. And it was definitely true that they were all better together. Now, we should be mindful of the fact that Barry, we can say, he had a lot of success in the stuff he did on his own. I mean, he did, what was it? He did an album or a song that was a hit with Barbra Streisand. He did a couple other hits with other people. He had a great writing ability where he could put together a tune on his own, though for the most part he wrote jointly with the Bee Gees. But so Barry, I'm sure, felt that to a greater degree than anybody else, I would argue. But I also believe that Barry saw his role as a big brother, and you saw him come in as a big brother. And if you look at interviews, they did it. Justin, what interview was it they were doing? And they were asked about their relationship, and they were very defensive about that, or they took easy offense regarding questions about their relationship. So there was this family tie between them that surpassed the musical and fame considerations. Anyway,
TV interview?
I think it was a TV interview, yeah. And in any case, it's okay if you can't find it, but they didn't want those questions asked. And this would have been, I'm guessing, in the early 2000s, may have been in the 90s.
Clive Anderson, All Talk in 1997.
Could have been. It was probably in the late 90s. That sounds about right. And they got up and walked off the stage. I mean, it was a little.
Yes, yeah, that was
it. It takes you by surprise because you don't see. Sometimes when an interviewee gets up and walks off the stage, they kind of storm off, and you see it coming. You know that if this interviewer keeps pressing here, this is going to happen. But this kind of exploded spontaneously, where I do think that the interviewer had been told they don't want to talk about problems between themselves. And they're very sensitive about it. But he decided to go there, and he didn't go very far to where they felt that he had encroached on their relationship. And they got up and just walked off. And so I think there was something between them that held them together that only a family relationship. I think that families are something very special. I think there's no other relationships like them. And I think in this case, the Bee Gees stayed together in a meaningful sense of the word their entire lives.
I mean, just being in a band in and of itself, you think of those people as family.
Yeah.
In a way, you share so many deep, you're just by the act of creating, it's a deep relationship already. But when you have a band that is family, that's an even stronger bond.
It's a bond that can survive those other things that break apart, though, what you're describing. On the one hand, yeah, there is a close relationship and this collective creative experience. And so, yeah, you can point to a lot of things that would be cohesive, but somehow, and we see it over and over, and what stands out are the exceptions. The people who didn't break up, those are the ones you can count almost on one hand if you go back to the 60s. How many groups did not break up for many years and maybe came back together in the last decade or two? They broke up, right? Surely they broke up. I mean, they were in so many pieces.
Yeah, that's the problem, because you have fractures of bands, and like these two guys continue on, and these other guys, they're forming their other tribute band or something like that.
And like what was it, Pink Floyd? There was this argument about
they're doing like two separate Pink Floyd.
I know. It depends on who you believe is the core of the band.
Yeah, Van Halen.
And but look at Rolling Stones. You got to hand it. You got to hand it to Rolling Stones. I mean, there was something special. But the point is, that's the exception. So the rule is that egos, money, despite this socialist, communal sort of rhetoric that you heard about people from that era, from the 60s, love, peace, rock and roll. Well, it's ego, money, and me. So I think that the fact that the Bee Gees endured that, there's no question the family relationship meant a lot to it. So let's come to the conclusion of Maurice's life. How old is he?
Yes, so he is 53 when he passes. He goes into the hospital.
Young.
I couldn't find the actual story on this or anything, or the reason why he was there in the first place. So maybe one of you guys know. But he was in the hospital for a surgery, and there was complications from a twisted intestine, and he passed away from that. Basically, it just got knotted, I guess is the best way to put that. And nothing, could pass through. And when that happens, your body can't function and it shuts down. So he passed away from a twisted intestine, basically. And he left his surviving wife and his two kids, and then obviously his brothers as well. And everybody just honestly couldn't believe it because, like we just said, he was so young and he was actually very healthy. He was, oddly enough, a big supporter of competitive paintball, and he played in a lot of paintball tournaments before his death. He was, in good shape, in good health, everything. It was just a very strange incident that killed him, and everybody was really devastated over it.
Yeah, I remember when I heard about his death that I thought this has to have been some sort of accident that happened, maybe a car wreck or something. I mean, 53, 54 years old, I mean, that's so young for people to die today. Usually when you die like that, often it is a result of an accident. But in his case, as you said, there was an intestinal block that put him in the hospital, and that was a crisis. But ultimately his death apparently was a heart attack that occurred on the table, as I've read. So it was one of those things that was unlikely, and that you would think somebody as fit as he is wouldn't have those problems. He was always lean. They all were, really. I don't remember any pictures of the Bee Gees with any weight on them. So you suspect that a lot of those things associated with being overweight, they'd avoid. So you're right. If the hobby is paintball, something like that, then it requires lots of activity. I mean, you have to move around and dodge and hide. And
I have never experienced more pain in my life.
Really?
Than playing paintball.
You've done this?
One time, but I was doing a lot of kneeling. My quads hurt so bad, I literally could not walk up and down stairs the next day.
I thought you were going to tell me there's the pain of being struck.
Well, that hurts. That
hurts too. Yeah, that very much hurts too. Especially some people will freeze paintballs because
oh my gosh,
they're just evil, and they'll go out there and they'll shoot you with them, and they don't explode, and they hurt. They leave big bruises.
Yeah, I can't play though because even though I had a non-fog mask, it would fog up my glasses, and I couldn't see anything. So I spent basically the whole match behind a tree, making sure no one hit me because I couldn't see anything.
Well,
so I did not have fun.
Well, the point, I mean, that is an unusual hobby for a guy in his 50s, I would think. I haven't looked at the statistics on this, but anyway, Maurice, by all appearances, was healthy. And yet this intestinal thing, and then ultimately the heart attack took his life. So let me pick up with some of the points relating to estate planning. Morris did do estate planning, and he was conscientious about that. He had prepared, over the course of his life, he had prepared a couple of wills and trusts, but one he prepared, the trusts that were in effect and the will that was in effect were prepared about 10 years or so before his death. And he did create, to his credit, and we talk about this often on the show, he did create 2 trusts for his children. And we don't know the terms of that, as those of you who watch this know. These are things that we can't, get access to because there's no public record of what those trusts are. But by all indications, they were set up to provide for care, financial assistance to these children over their lifetimes, as opposed to being dispensed, the money distributed at the time of Morris's death. So we know that there was good planning involved. We know that that Morris had a substantial amount of money. There were estimates of the value of his estate at his death. Again, these are estimates because not everything ran through the probate estate, but the estimates range. If you research it, you'll find some places listed 100,000. I saw 150. I saw 200 on a website that I thought was pretty reliable. So we just don't know, because he was smart enough that once you create trusts like that, you want to go ahead and put assets in them. You don't want to wait and have the assets go through the probate estate, and all the hassles that are associated with that, and then transfer it into the trust, which is the alternative. While some people will deliberately do that with particular assets, and they have their own reasons. It might be that putting it in the trust triggers a due on sell clause, or maybe accelerate a debt that you owe. For example, if you have a mortgage, sometimes the small print in the mortgage will say if it's transferred to any other person or entity, that this will trigger what's called accelerating the outstanding loan, which means you have to write a check immediately for the full balance of the loan. So there are things where people might pause before they put it in their trust. And sometimes they may anticipate that they're going to be transferring it to third parties or in pieces, and they may feel that that additional step of the trust being involved is something they don't want to bother with. Another reason I'd mention. But for the most part, the substantial majority of your assets should be in your trust so they don't go through the probate estate. And by the way, when you have assets where it appears to be a due on sell clause or appears to be what's called the acceleration clause for debts, often those will be waived. In other words, while the language will typically catch a revocable trust, usually if you go to the bank and you talk to somebody in the loan department, you can get a waiver of that. I know some people some attorneys even, who go ahead and ignore it because they know that the bank isn't going to either notice it or bother with it. And to be honest with you, often that's right. It's not the advice that I dispense to people who are deciding whether to put assets in a trust or not. I would rather you be confident that it's not going to be interfered with. And the way to be confident is to get the waiver that is typically gotten without any hassle from a lender or another third party that might have a due on sell clause. Because there's no meaningful reason to not grant the waiver. It's no threat to these people to put it in a revocable trust. Anyway, so in this case, most of the assets did go into these trusts. And we know that I'm sure there was a trust set up. Whenever you're doing it for the kids, you're also setting up something for the surviving spouse. There was no mention of it in the research that we did, but we're confident there was a trust for Yvonne as well. So some assets went through the estate, less than a couple million, in excess of a couple million. And those things would have been distributed according to the terms of the trust. So it's called a pour-over will. So those would have also gone into the trust. The bottom line is that Morris wanted to set up money for the children, but he apparently wanted his wife to have, surviving spouse to have complete control over the intellectual property. And we'll talk a little bit more about the intellectual property in a second. But there's another asset, for lack of a better way to put it, that related to the cause of death of Morris. So this requires a little bit of discussion about personal injury law, of which I'm not an authority. Cordell & Cordell does family law, domestic relations. Tucker Allen does estate planning, but I don't do personal injury. But having issued that disclaimer, I know a little bit about it. Some of my friends are personal injury lawyers, believe it or not. So we're going to break right here. We're going to divide this show into 2 parts. So I look forward to your joining us for part 2 on the life and legacy of Maurice Gibb.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.